We're going to be talking about ecology in depth now, and so I want to start out by just introducing what is ecology, the central questions, and then begin exploring that more. So ecology is the study of interactions among organisms and their environment. If you remember back to the hierarchy of organization of biology, this is the population level, the community level, and the ecosystem level. So really looking at living things at a broader scale than just what's happening inside of a living organism. There's two major categories. Biotic interactions are interactions among living things. So this is within a species. So maybe between two zebras, for example, or between species, like between a zebra and a lion. And those are, again, one way to look at ecology. And the other type of interaction that's important in ecology is abiotic interactions. Abiotic means non-living, so that's interactions between organisms and the physical and chemical features of their non-living environment. So things like rivers, moisture in the air, wind, light. These things have a strong influence on organisms, even though they're non-living parts of their environment. And so they have a big influence on ecology. So within that idea of ecology studying these interactions, there's really several more specific questions that ecology focuses on that we're going to be building on, again, as we move through these ecology chapters. So one of the ways that we sort of measure interactions among organisms and their environment is by looking at where organisms are and how many organisms there are. How dense are they? Do they pack close? Do they stay far away from each other? And then how is their population size changing? How is their density changing? Is there a reason, right? And this is where a lot of human stuff gets involved, like how are humans impacting that? Ecology is also asking questions about how different organisms affect each other. And so not just humans and their impacts on organisms, but how a lion population affects a zebra population, for example. Ecology is interested in how organisms got where they are, right? So this brings in the evolution piece sometimes too. So why is there a certain type of organism in one area but not in another? And that also brings in the why there's organisms only in particular areas. And that can be about like physical features, right? Is there enough water? Is there enough food? And then all of these tie to how humans and human activities are affecting all of these things. And so you kind of have to understand the base to understand how humans are affecting organisms. So we'll start out by focusing on the physical features of the environment. These are also called abiotic factors. So abiotic means non-living again. And these abiotic factors influence the distribution and abundance of species, right? So these have a very strong influence on organisms. So the physical features include things like temperature, wind, availability of water, availability of light, salt levels, that's salinity, and pH. Remember, pH is the amount of hydrogen ions in water. And so these are all going to impact living things quite a bit. In addition to just directly impacting living things, the physical features of an environment overall, like all of these things together, the wind, the water, the light, the salt, the pH, the temperature, these create a climate pattern to different parts of Earth. So they all work together to create like what does it feel like on a coast? What does it feel like in the desert? Are all contributed to by these different physical features. So we'll focus first on temperature because it is the most important physical factor in the distribution of organisms across the globe. That means it has the highest impact. Why is it so important? Because it has direct impacts on biological processes. So remember that organisms can only tolerate so warm of a temperature because if it goes too high, that denatures proteins and prevents chemical reactions. But on the other hand, if temperatures get too cold, there's not enough activation energy for chemical reactions to occur. So that's a little bit of a reminder from previous biology classes. In addition to that importance of having activation energy and denaturation of proteins, you also have, like, if you get below zero, so going not just cool, but beyond freezing, frost, and that can actually directly damage tissues and cells. So, for example, most plants, or a lot, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of plants are frost sensitive. And so when the first frost comes in the fall, that means the first time it drops below a certain temperature to 0 Celsius, I should say, it's actually 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you see damage to plant tissues. So they'll almost look wilted. Or you may have seen this happen in your fridge too. So if your vegetables accidentally freeze in your fridge. So this impact, right? So the frost, the hot, the cold, this is particularly strong on ectothermic animals. So most animals are ectothermic, and most organisms are unable to regulate their temperature. So plants can't regulate their temperature. Most reptiles, remember, except for birds, insects, all of these different organisms cannot regulate their body temperature. And so they are at a victim of whatever temperature the environment is. Okay, and so that's why it's so critical for so many organisms that they can only live in a specific temperature range. That being said, right, endothermic animals, which you would say, okay, well, they're able to regulate their body temperature, so they should be less affected by temperature. But even they are still limited, right? So you do see endothermic animals able to do well in more places, but they still have a lot of energy requirements in low temperatures. So if you have organisms that are living, for example, in snow all of the year round, that takes a really high energy demand. And so that can be really hard for a lot of organisms. So you still see less organisms in cold regions, basically. So when you look at organisms, right, they have to have adaptations for dealing with the temperature range that they live in. So adaptations for cold regions and adaptations for hot regions. Organisms have to have both, right? So cold regions, you might see things like insulation, thicker fur, right? Hot regions, you might see adaptations for evapotranspiration or sweating or water conservation. So organisms have to adapt to the temperature range that they live in. So how do we get the dramatic temperature ranges on Earth's surface? A lot of it has to do with just basically the distance from the sun and the Earth being round. So the intensity of the solar radiation, the strength of the sun's rays, is higher at the equator. And so this illustration is showing this, right? So because the Earth's a circle, there's the sun over here. The sun is actually like a little bit closer, if you will, to the equator. And it's a relatively small surface area where it's hitting the equator. And so you get more warmth essentially there. And then if you look at the pole, you have a larger surface area that is distributing across, and it's further away from the sun. And so you get relatively lower temperatures. So temperatures on Earth are influenced by the greenhouse effect, and this relates to, again, the sun as well. So what happens is you have the sun shining down into onto Earth's surface. It passes through the atmosphere and then hits the Earth's surface, and then it actually, a lot of it just bounces back from Earth's surface and goes back into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere holds that in. The atmosphere is almost like a blanket. It doesn't let the heat go out very much. So it actually holds it in and actually re-radiates it back to Earth's surface, right? So warmth is just staying, once it hits Earth, it's staying inside of this atmosphere and re-radiating. And so that warms up Earth. And so this greenhouse effect is often talked about in a negative context because some of the chemicals that create the greenhouse effect are things like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons. And you probably have heard of some of these CFCs, carbon dioxide, methane, especially as greenhouse gases that humans are impacting. And so humans have been increasing the greenhouse effect in a way that's increasing the average global temperature. So that's the negative aspects of greenhouse gases. But on the other hand, without the greenhouse effect, life on Earth wouldn't exist. If we didn't have an atmosphere, then our temperatures would dramatically fluctuate. So it'd be super, 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 super cold at night and super, 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 super hot during the day. And so when you look at planets that don't have atmospheric gases like like Earth does, you do see those dramatic temperature fluctuations. And that life on Earth, as we know it, would not be possible with those temperature fluctuations. So again, we talk about greenhouse gases in a really negative light because absolutely humans are impacting the concentration of those greenhouse gases and increasing that greenhouse effect at a rate in which living things cannot tolerate that rate of change. And we're seeing evidence of that now. But it's also a good thing for life on Earth, and it has been historically. And so that's the confusing thing about the greenhouse effect. And that's what's confusing about climate change for people as well. All right, I'm going to stop there.